Colossus is the most advanced lineup optimizer in daily fantasy sports. Lock and exclude players. Adjust player exposure to reduce risk of injury or poor performance. Customize individual projections or upload your own projections. Generate hundreds of optimal lineups in seconds. Name and save the best lineups. Create winning lineups for the top sites like DraftKings and FanDuel for free at dailyfantasycafe.com.
Hello and welcome to the first edition of The Backfield, talking about running backs and running back analysis. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. We're talking about the best options for week one. Obviously some expensive options, some cheap options, some GPPs, a little bit of everything. So go ahead and get things started off with the article you wrote, of course. Top play, elite play, Eddie Lacy. Really hard to argue this one. I mean, depending on who you ask, where you look, this may be the worst offense or worst defense in all of football. Chicago Bears defense just an absolute mess. You got the Packers are a sizable favorite, almost a full touchdown now. So, I mean, Eddie Lacy, if you're paying, I mean, he's not even that expensive, really. $7,500 on DraftKings is not too bad of a price for a guy that could just end up just dominating this team, especially if they get up big. He's going to be the workhorse, and 9 straight regular season games with 100-plus total yards, so he's the dual threat. I mean, this guy just has it all. I think he's a great play in all formats this week.
Yeah, and the thing that really is kind of the kicker for me is the fact that he was much more involved in the passing game towards the end of last season. He even had an 8-reception game.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not really expecting that for week one, but, maybe 3 or 4 receptions, 30 yards or so. That really doesn't hurt, especially on DraftKings with that PPR format. But yeah, Green Bay, the highest spread, actually tied with the Cowboys as 6 to 7 point favorites, depending on where you look.
Yeah.
But the Cowboys backfield, that's probably one to avoid this week because we really don't know how it's going to shake out. We got 3 different guys in the mix, probably all getting 8 to 10 carries. So yeah, that leaves Lacy as the top running back beneficiary from this spread. Should get his 20-plus carries, 3 or 4 catches. Just an easy pick for cash games.
Yeah, and just to further your point there on the targets, in case you are new to NFL or weren't around for the preseason, Jordy Nelson being out definitely is going to help his role in that offense too. So definitely expecting him to take on a little bit higher of a role. And next up we got Jeremy Hill. And we're talking about this one mostly because he's facing the Raiders, who are a bad offense or a bad defense. You could say average at best if you're being generous with this defense, but not a defense that you're worried about. And Jeremy Hill, downfield runner. I mean, he's got speed, he's got power, all around great running back. And I mean, you got to pay top-notch price for him. But this was a guy who last year kind of thought it was going to be a timeshare with he and Giovanni Bernard, and he kind of just took away that top spot and turned Gio into the third down back. So he's the guy there in Cincinnati, and obviously with inconsistencies at quarterback, they do have some other options back, but this is a team that's going to be relying on Hill quite a bit in games like this that they should win, if not for no other reason than to control the clock.
Yeah, and I actually looked it up, and Oakland, despite ranking 22nd against the run in total yardage last year, they ranked 8th in yards per carry. So, more of that speaking to the volume opponents are running against them and touchdowns allowed than necessarily, their inefficiencies on defense themselves. But having said that, those two things, I mean, Hill's supposed to be the goal line back. They're fairly generous in the red zone, Oakland that is. And he'll get the volume in this game, especially, 3.5 point favorite. Cincinnati's supposed to be in control, even though this is on the road. So, yeah, I'm expecting Hill to get his 20-plus carries. 2 touchdowns is not inconceivable here.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you there. It's definitely a great spot for him. And then looking over at another option, also, this is a guy that I love as well as you, and especially on DraftKings where his price is just ridiculously low. Chris Ivory for the Jets. I mean, we've seen this guy kind of bounce around a little bit, and then he shared time before with Chris Johnson, and none of us really seem to know why because Chris Johnson was just totally ineffective. So, got to imagine that on DraftKings, he's going to be, if not the highest owned running back, then very close to it at that price against a Cleveland team that, they're not a terrible defense, but this is definitely a very exploitable defense, and especially with the Jets, and they have upgraded their receivers, of course. You got Brandon Marshall, Eric Decker there now, but it is Ryan Fitzpatrick, who has never been a volume thrower. So this is a team that's still a run-first offense, and you got to imagine that Ivory's going to be like the glue for your cash games here.
Yeah, and in that article, I put Ivory's expected ownership at 35 to 40 or so, and that might even be a little bit understated, especially on DraftKings, where you could theoretically roster three running backs with that flex spot. So he's a good RB2 on both sites, good for a flex position on DraftKings as well. And Cleveland was worst in the league against the run last year, so you put a cheap price point, guy who's expected to get a lot of carries, goal line work. They're favored at home. I mean, everything just adds up for Ivory, and I think a lot of people are seeing that, and he's going to be really popular, but for good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. So not a bad way to go if you're trying to save some money, get some of these big wide receivers or whoever else you're trying to pay up for. Another guy who's really cheap, DraftKings specific, Doug Martin, $4,500. I mean, we're talking about a run defense that was down there with the Browns last season as one of the worst. I mean, we saw, I believe, multiple 150-yard games in a row they allowed last year. I mean, even a decent running back was tearing them up. But Doug Martin, not so much last year where there was trouble in the backfield. You didn't know who was going to get the carries or who was healthy or any of those things. So a lot of uncertainty. But we did see a couple of years ago, Doug Martin can be a very effective back when he gets time. So especially in this kind of matchup, even if he's not the main running back, even if he only gets about 15 carries, he could easily pay off that cheap salary.
Yeah, and there should be plenty of attempts to go around. Tampa is supposed to be favored in this game, so going up against a rookie QB who is on the road as the game's played in Tampa there. Pretty good situation for the Buccaneers running game. But Doug Martin, he looked like himself in the preseason,
Yep.
and I think the coaches really are going to take notice, give him the ball maybe more than Rainey and the other guys, or at least that's the way things appear moving into the season opener. So Doug Martin against the second worst rushing defense in the league. The Titans are to the Browns, as we mentioned before. It looks like another good spot for him to put up at least 70 yards and a touchdown. And for that price on DraftKings, yeah, that's a great flex play, great RB2 play.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And then one of my favorite plays, week one, I agree with you here, Tevin Coleman finally announces the starter, and rightfully so. I mean, we've seen Devonta Freeman have his chance to take that job. It's been a complete mess in that Atlanta backfield. Even when they had Steven Jackson, I mean, just tons of inconsistency over the past few years. But Tevin Coleman was an elite back in college, ran for over 2,000 yards last year. This is a guy against Philly, highest projected total of the week, and it's not even particularly close. I mean, if you take out that Cowboys game, I mean, they're almost a full touchdown ahead of every other game. So lots of points to go around in this one. Another guy who's really cheap on DraftKings, and you expect he's probably going to see a decent amount of volume. And Devonta Freeman isn't even guaranteed to be playing in this game, still nursing an injury. So if he sits out especially, I mean, Tevin Coleman, massive upside. And we've seen this is a very skilled runner. This isn't just your average rookie coming into the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, if you watched him at all, Indiana last year, you could see that he was pretty NFL ready.
Yeah.
But yeah, if Freeman is out, I would bump him from GPP to straight value play,
Yep.
with much less risk involved. The only reason I have him as a GPP play here, and I mean, he could be a borderline value play as well if you look at him that way, but we aren't really sure what the scheme will be, how they will use him. Obviously, they like him, they want to get him involved, but we don't know how exactly he's going to incorporate in this passing game, or if Freeman's playing, maybe Freeman will get a little more time than we think. So those uncertainties plus Philadelphia being one of the better run defenses in the league last year, they ranked 5th overall in yards per carry. So you put those together, it does add some risk. But as you said, very talented runner, high-scoring game, should be back and forth. I mean, he should have the ball in his hands quite a bit. So there definitely is upside there despite that risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another guy, I'm sure you know this name by now, the way that he broke out the second half of last season, C.J. Anderson. We know he's a huge part of the passing game, but really anyone who steps on the field for the Broncos becomes a big part of that passing game. Finally took over that job. Originally it was he and Monte Ball. Now Monte Ball is just not even on a roster anymore. So C.J. Anderson, a guy that we've seen massive, massive upside from him because, like we mentioned, he's involved in the passing game. He's a volume back as well. And you got Peyton Manning under center. Anything there is possible. Of course, Denver projected to score 27 points against Baltimore. This is a Baltimore defense that is not a bad defense, but certainly a defense that has been on the downward slope recently. Now missing guys like Lodinata, who was a huge part of that defense. He's gone to Detroit. So this could be a defense that could have some trouble with good running backs like C.J. Anderson this week, and all season, but starting with Anderson this week.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think a lot of people will be off Anderson this week because Baltimore was number 1 last season in rushing defense. So if you look at projection systems and stuff, they really don't like him for his price point. So I think a lot of people are going to buy into that, overlook C.J. Anderson, maybe go to guys like Eddie Lacy or Hill, Adrian Peterson, guys like that for a similar salary, just because, Anderson supposedly has a tougher matchup. But as you said, the Ravens, I'm not expecting them to be as good this year on defense, missing a few guys up front there. And on top of that, Anderson's going to see the volume. I mean, Peyton Manning's going to work his team up and down the field. The new offensive coordinator there in Denver, more run-oriented approach maybe to kind of save Peyton Manning, save his arm, so he can last throughout the season. All these things really build his fantasy rationale, C.J. Anderson, that is. And you got to love it when they get in the red zone there. Peyton leads the team downfield, and Anderson does a 7-yard draw play to get into the end zone. Not your traditional running approach that Baltimore shut down last season. So I think you have to view Anderson and the Broncos in a different light in that regard, and that's why I really like him this week.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, they made a lot of creative ways to get him the ball last season because he's fast and he's elusive. I mean, he's got a lot of great things going for him. So I'm with you there. Another guy that I would really like in tournaments. I'm kind of concerned that his name recognition in itself is going to raise his ownership, but I do think that the perceived tough matchup is going to lower his ownership, and that's Adrian Peterson. It's a San Francisco defense that's been one of the better in the league all over the past few seasons, but now you got some guys that retired. I mean, you've got some guys that left. This is not anywhere near the defense we've seen over the past couple seasons. So a guy like Adrian Peterson, who really, is essentially matchup proof when he's healthy anyway, arguably the most talented back in the league, depending on who you ask. But that's a guy that I think people will see that San Francisco, especially places like DraftKings where you see the power rankings next to it, see that it's red, looks like a tough matchup, but I have zero concern about the matchup for Adrian Peterson this week.
Yeah, that's a great point. I considered him putting in my top tier in that article, but ultimately I went with Lacy and Hill because they are cheaper on FanDuel. So if you have the extra cap space to go with Peterson, I don't hate it at all, but I think Lacy and Hill, particularly Lacy, gives you a little more bang for the buck over there. Over on DraftKings, they're pretty similarly priced, so it's more of a debate there, even though Peterson might not have as much to do in the passing game as Lacy. Hill really isn't involved in the passing game at all there. So, I like Peterson as well. He's a guy who just barely missed my article.
Yeah, absolutely. So take these notes, take some ideas, some salaries, maybe some strategies from this while you're building your Week 1 lineups. And check us out on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to this YouTube channel and check out all the rest of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.